Born into wealth and privilege, Donald Trump grew up under the influence of his father, Fred Trump, a demanding businessman known for his tough tactics. This upbringing may have fostered a sense of entitlement and exceptionalism, core traits associated with narcissism. The emphasis on winning and material success, potentially at the expense of ethical considerations, could have modeled behaviors sometimes seen in individuals with antisocial tendencies, a focus on personal gain over societal rules or empathy. This foundational environment, emphasizing dominance and wealth, arguably shaped his later transactional worldview, viewing relationships and politics as contests to be won, and fostering a belief in his inherent superiority, visible during his presidency. Described as energetic and assertive, his behavioral issues led to his enrollment in the New York Military Academy. While providing structure, the Academy's hierarchical environment might have reinforced a belief in top-down authority and the value of dominance rather than necessarily instilling deep discipline or respect for rules he didn't create, consistent with both narcissistic self-perception and potential authoritarian leanings. His later presidential leadership style, demanding absolute loyalty, praising autocratic leaders, and showing impatience with democratic processes such as checks and balances and dissent, could be seen as reflecting this early imprinting of hierarchical command structures combined with an inherent assertiveness. Attending Fordham and then Wharton, Trump frequently touted his Wharton degree as proof of superior intellect, a behavior some see as narcissistic grandiosity. His avoidance of the Vietnam War via multiple deferments, culminating in a medical deferment for bone spurs, has been interpreted by critics as demonstrating a pattern of using privilege and potentially questionable means to avoid obligations or consequences others face, which could align with traits of entitlement or an antisocial disregard for societal expectations. During his presidency, his simultaneous strong pro-military rhetoric and dismissive comments about military leaders who disagreed with him or about prisoners of war struck critics as contradictory, potentially reflecting a narcissistic view where military service is valued abstractly, but personal sacrifice is avoided, and loyalty to him trumps other principles. Taking control and rebranding his father's company, Trump shifted towards high-profile, self-branded projects. His reliance on significant debt, government incentives, and aggressive negotiation tactics established a pattern of leveraging systems for maximum personal benefit. The early 1970s Justice Department lawsuit alleging racial discrimination, accusing him of refusing to rent to black tenants, settled without admitting guilt, could be viewed by critics as demonstrating an early disregard for social norms and potential harm caused to others in pursuit of business goals, a trait sometimes associated with antisocial patterns. This focus on large, visible projects like Trump Tower and personal branding aligns with narcissistic needs for admiration and recognition. His approach to deals, maximum leverage, exploiting rules like tax abatements and challenging regulations, mirrored his presidential actions, such as demanding concessions in trade deals and prioritizing deregulation, often framed as beneficial to America but heavily reliant on his personal deal-making image. The discrimination suit foreshadowed later controversies over rhetoric and policies impacting minority groups during his presidency. The 1980s saw Trump cultivate an image of immense success and opulence, feeding a narcissistic need for public admiration. His book The Art of the Deal promoted this image. However, the subsequent bankruptcies of his casinos revealed extreme risk-taking and potentially reckless financial management. His ability to survive these crises by renegotiating debts could be interpreted not just as resilience, but as a demonstration of exploiting legal and financial systems to avoid personal ruin, potentially reflecting an antisocial tendency to disregard the consequences for lenders, investors, or employees. The dealmaker persona, central to his presidential appeal, was forged here. His presidency often prioritized optics and wins over policy details. His history of navigating financial crises perhaps emboldened a willingness to challenge established economic norms and international agreements, viewing them as mere starting points for renegotiation where he could force better terms, regardless of prior commitments. A potentially narcissistic belief in his ability to bend any situation to his will. The Apprentice transformed Trump into a global icon of decisive leadership, defined by the catchphrase, "You're fired." This role allowed him to project an image of absolute authority and control, significantly boosting his public persona and potentially reinforcing narcissistic self-views. The show's manufactured reality provided a platform to hone skills in manipulating narratives and commanding attention. This television persona was arguably instrumental in his political rise, presenting a simplified image of strength that appealed to many. His presidential communication style, often dramatic, focused on loyalty, quick to dismiss dissenting voices with "you're fired," echoing in high staff turnover, seemed to blur the lines between reality TV and governance. This platform could be seen as crucial preparation for a leadership style centered on personality cult rather than policy substance, a hallmark of many authoritarian figures. Trump's sporadic explorations of presidential runs and changing party affiliations 5 different times, including being a registered Democrat from 2001 to 2009, suggested to critics not ideological evolution, but opportunism, adopting positions and labels convenient for gaining attention or power. His long-held protectionist and nationalist views, America First, could be seen as appealing to populist sentiments but also potentially reflecting a narcissistic worldview centered on self-interest projected onto the nation, with little regard for alliances or global cooperation. The America First doctrine during his presidency involved alienating allies and withdrawing from international agreements, actions consistent with this potentially narcissistic or even isolationist worldview. His apparent lack of fixed ideology allowed him to reshape the Republican Party around his personality and priorities. His aggressive promotion of the baseless theory questioning Obama's birthplace was a turning point. Critics view this as a cynical ploy exploiting racial anxieties and undermining democratic legitimacy for personal political gain. This willingness to propagate damaging falsehoods could be interpreted as reflecting a lack of empathy, a profound disregard for truth, potentially aligning with antisocial traits, and a tactic to delegitimize opponents' common features in authoritarian movements. This episode normalized the use of blatant misinformation as a political tool, a technique heavily employed during his presidency, for example, fake news, election fraud claims. It demonstrated an effectiveness in mobilizing a base through grievance and attacks on perceived elites or outsiders, laying groundwork for a presidency that often operated outside established factual frameworks. Launching his campaign with inflammatory remarks about immigrants, Trump centered his platform on themes of national decline and restoration through his singular leadership. "I alone can fix it." The slogan, "Make America Great Again," promised a return to a perceived better past under his strong guidance. This rhetoric strongly aligns with narcissistic self-aggrandizement and authoritarian appeals to a strongman figure. The focus on building a wall represented a concrete symbol of exclusion and nationalist assertion. These campaign themes directly translated into presidential policies, such as the border wall, travel bans, and trade wars. The "I alone can fix it" sentiment foreshadowed a presidency where loyalty to him was paramount and expertise often dismissed. His unconventional campaign, fueled by rallies creating intense emotional connection with his base, constant media manipulation through provocative statements and relentless attacks on opponents, could be seen as reflecting narcissistic attention-seeking and an antisocial willingness to break established political norms. Winning the Electoral College despite losing the popular vote in 2020, according to critics, further entrenched a sense that established rules could be circumvented or were unimportant compared to achieving victory. This campaign style became his governing style. Rallies continued. Twitter was used to bypass media and attack critics, and controversy often drove the news cycle. The popular vote loss perhaps fueled a persistent sense of grievance and delegitimization of opposition, consistent with narcissistic sensitivity to criticism, and potentially reinforcing authoritarian impulses to consolidate power against perceived threats. While enacting conservative policies like tax cuts and deregulation, the manner often reflected his persona. Appointing judges focused on loyalty and ideology, particularly the Supreme Court picks, was framed as fulfilling promises but also served to solidify power. Actions like withdrawing from international agreements unilaterally demonstrated an impulsive style and disregard for diplomatic norms, consistent with narcissistic self-belief, overriding expert advice or alliances. The focus on symbolic projects like the border wall continued. These actions pleased his base but were often executed in ways critics saw as damaging institutional norms and long-term alliances, prioritizing short-term wins or personal validation over stability. Patterns potentially linked to narcissistic impulsivity and an authoritarian desire to reshape systems according to personal will. His presidency was characterized by demands for absolute loyalty, public attacks on the judiciary and intelligence agencies, often referred to as the deep state, and the press, labeled as the enemy of the people. High staff turnover was often linked to perceived disloyalty, and there was frequent use of executive orders. These actions are frequently cited by critics as evidence of authoritarian tendencies attempting to undermine checks on executive power and delegitimize sources of independent information or oversight. The two impeachments arose from actions like pressuring Ukraine for political dirt and inciting supporters before the Capitol attack, seen as abuses of power, reflecting a potential belief that he was above the law, a trait associated with extreme narcissism and antisocial behavior. This style directly threatened democratic norms. Attacks on the press aimed to control the narrative, demands for loyalty sought to ensure personal control over the state apparatus, and challenging legal and investigative processes aimed to establish impunity. All hallmarks of authoritarian consolidation. His handling of the pandemic, marked by downplaying the threat, promoting unproven cures, contradicting public health experts, and prioritizing the economy, was interpreted by critics as reflecting narcissistic tendencies. This includes an unwillingness to accept bad news or defer to expertise, and a focus on personal image and intuition. Additionally, there was potentially an antisocial disregard for the well-being of the population in favor of political or economic goals. This response arguably demonstrated a governance style where personal beliefs and political expediency trumped scientific evidence and collective welfare. It further eroded trust in institutions and potentially aligned with an authoritarian model where the leader's narrative is paramount. Trump's sustained campaign to overturn his election loss through false claims of fraud, pressure on officials, and culminating in the January 6th rally and subsequent Capitol attack, is considered by many critics the most direct evidence of authoritarian ambitions and a profound narcissistic inability to accept defeat. The alleged disregard for the peaceful transfer of power and the rule of law, potentially inciting violence to remain in power, represents behavior consistent with the most severe interpretations of narcissism and antisocial traits directly challenging the foundations of democracy. This sequence of events was central to concerns about a potential second term, demonstrating a willingness to discard democratic processes entirely when they didn't serve his personal interests. It embodied the core fear of critics regarding dictatorial tendencies. Maintaining control over a large segment of the Republican Party while relentlessly propagating the big lie about the 2020 election suggested a continued focus on personal grievance and loyalty tests, hallmarks of narcissistic leadership. This narrative served to delegitimize the concurrent government and potentially laid the groundwork for future challenges to democratic outcomes. His enduring influence suggested a party shaped in his image, potentially more willing to support challenges to democratic norms in a second term. The numerous investigations and indictments, including those related to classified documents, January 6th, election interference, and hush money, stemmed from actions before, during, and after his first term. Critics argue these reflected a lifelong pattern of disregarding rules, potential abuses of power, and a belief in personal impunity, consistent with interpretations of narcissism and antisocial behavior. Relevance for his upcoming second term, how these legal issues unfolded did little to dissuade his base. His reaction, attacking the justice system and investigators, reinforced the narrative of being persecuted, regardless of whether he was found guilty or liable of wrongdoing. This resonated with his base, but also demonstrated a pattern of attempting to dismantle accountability structures, which is a key step in authoritarian consolidation. His campaign for a second term continued familiar themes, but added overt promises of retribution against political enemies and hinted at using presidential power to target opponents. This rhetoric was seen by critics as explicitly authoritarian, signaling an intention to weaponize the government for personal and political vendettas. This moved beyond norm-breaking towards potentially dismantling democratic safeguards. Relevance for his upcoming second term, this explicit language about retribution suggested a second term could be focused on consolidating power and punishing dissent. It fulfilled the dictatorial potential critics had long warned about, rooted in perceived lifelong patterns of narcissistic injury, desire for control, and disregard for constraints. Since taking office on January 20, 2025, President Trump's administration has rapidly implemented policies reflecting campaign promises, breathtaking in their authoritarian audacity for disregarding constitutional norms. On his first day, Trump signed an unprecedented number of executive orders, reportedly 26, far more than recent predecessors. He also issued pardons for approximately 1,500 individuals convicted for the January 6 Capitol attack. This swift use of executive power and the specific pardons can be viewed as demonstrating a narcissistic assertion of dominance, acting decisively and unbound by convention. It also potentially represents authoritarian retribution and reward, using pardon power to favor those seen as loyal or aligned with his challenges to the 2020 election outcome, while signaling disregard for the event itself. Trump established a task force called the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, led by businessman Elon Musk, tasked with cutting federal spending and bureaucracy. This initiative reportedly oversees mass layoffs of civil servants, aligning with prior plans, known as Schedule F, to remove perceived institutional resistance, often referred to as the deep state. Actions were also taken against perceived hostile law firms. This reflects a potential narcissistic demand for absolute control and loyalty within the government, and an authoritarian strategy to dismantle institutional checks by replacing career officials with loyalists. Directives were issued ending remote work for federal employees and eliminating diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, framed as restoring merit, but potentially aimed at reshaping the workforce ideologically. Immediately upon taking office, Trump signed executive orders to block asylum seekers, reinstated the national emergency at the border, designated drug cartels as terrorist organizations, and initiated mass deportation procedures. The Laken-Riley Act was signed into law. Efforts to end birthright citizenship were initiated. These aggressive actions fulfill campaign promises popular with his base, but can be interpreted as reflecting nationalistic or potentially xenophobic impulses often associated with authoritarian regimes, and a narcissistic focus on projecting strength through harsh measures regardless of humanitarian concerns or complex legal challenges. Shutting down the CBP-1 program further restricted pathways for legal entry. The administration withdrew the United States from the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Accords. It initiated new trade conflicts, imposing a 10% tariff on most imports and higher tariffs, over 30% on specific countries, including up to 245% on China, causing market disruption and worldwide economic uncertainty. He also expressed interest in annexing territories like Canada or Greenland. These actions demonstrated disregard for international cooperation and established economic practices, consistent with an America First ideology that critics might view as isolationist or rooted in narcissistic national self-interest. Challenging alliances and imposing unilateral tariffs align with an authoritarian tendency to prioritize national assertion over global stability or agreements. Signing roughly 70 executive orders within the first month, many facing legal challenges, indicates a willingness to push the boundaries of presidential authority. Actions like attempting to end birthright citizenship via executive order represent a significant challenge to established constitutional interpretation. This approach aligns with a potential narcissistic impatience with legal or legislative constraints and an authoritarian preference for unilateral action. Alongside major policy shifts, executive orders addressed cultural issues such as affirming only two sexes, restricting flags flown at embassies to the American flag, ending radical indoctrination in schools, and protecting children from gender-affirming care. These actions appeal directly to his base's cultural grievances, and can be seen as reflecting a narcissistic focus on symbolic victories and culture war battles that energize supporters, a common tactic in populist and authoritarian movements to solidify loyalty. The initial months of Trump's second term appear characterized by rapid, aggressive actions aimed at consolidating executive power, fulfilling nationalist promises, especially on immigration and trade, rewarding loyalty, while potentially punishing dissent, dismantling perceived opposition within the government, and challenging established domestic and international norms, consistent with patterns critics associate with narcissistic and authoritarian leadership. In summary, viewing Trump's life from early business dealings and media manipulation to his presidency and current political activity is driven by narcissistic needs for admiration and control, antisocial disregard for rules and empathy, and culminating in authoritarian aspirations to subvert democratic institutions for personal power and retribution. Stand up, speak out, and never give in to this man we now call president. Our democracy depends on it. Thank you.